especially people in the health fields and art educator, right? I thought, oh gosh, music educator? Art educator. So what I did, we did this same I did the same presentation in the fall, but I just added some material to it and said assessing and modifying student learning outcomes now, because what we're finding is that as people dive into this assessment and start actually working it, they're discovering that, oh, you know, this isn't exactly what we're doing, and so how are we going to modify, and is there a certain time frame in which you can modify, and some other maybe issues we should address that we didn't because we have been in crisis mode, and as we're getting everybody's materials now, the crisis mode is sort of decreasing a bit, and we're able to look at material, and everyone's feeling a little better because at least they have something on paper. It's like, okay, starting the paper. I wrote the plan. And, so now people are saying, but you know what, the plan, we need to change it. So I'm going to just touch briefly on maybe as we start thinking about change, what are some reasons why we should be driven to change? Okay, and of course with all assessment, there's no universal standard about you can only change here. I mean, can you change in mid-cycle? So we're in the middle of a year now. Can you change your plan in mid-cycle? And there's no rules that say yes or no. So that's why sometimes we may seem a little like we don't know what we're doing. It's because there are no rules. There's, for everything you want to do, there's 500 examples of how people do it differently. So we have to make up our own strategies and policies, and that's what these sessions help us do. So anyway, I met Holly, our new faculty member, and I know everyone else, so welcome, and everybody. Holly met everybody else, right? So Keiko, did you meet Keiko? All right, there's Keiko Norm. She's in our foreign language department.
I'm Mary Elizabeth Meyer. Who's the art department? I'm Chantal Aubrey. I'm the assessment graduate assistant.
Yes, we love Chantal. She has helped everybody who's working on this sleep a little better because she's been doing I mean, this is labor-intensive work, and so she's taken a big piece of the labor away. So she's been doing a great job. And something you may hear from her. She's doing her thesis on how did we roll out the core gen ed evaluation, what could we have done differently, you know, how are our communication processes, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to keep improving, and of course part of what we are expected to do by middle states is to assess our own assessment process. So this will help us gather some information on that piece. So not only do you all have to assess, we have to assess how did we do assessing. So it's just a beautiful thing. So today we want to sort of distinguish what is a program, what's a course, and what's a student learning outcome. Are they one and the same? And how do we modify student learning outcomes?
I don't know how it sounds both obsession.
Obsession?
Oh, you know how it's like pronounced like Japanese F, and with me, it's like obsession.
And one thing we just didn't get the time to do as a university is to spend some time convincing people that assessment's a good thing. And when we just had to be sort of directive and top down, okay, this is what we need to do, it irritated people, and I understand that, but there's a lot of good that comes out of assessment. And I think most people, that's my comment that I'm hearing from people who are engaged. Yeah, we discovered this, and we're going to change this, and that's basically what it's all about. And, you know, we need to make sure that we're doing what we say we're doing. And through assessment and how our students perform, that's what we are doing. We're actually determining if we are doing what we say we are doing. And I like the second phrase here. Assessment deconstructs the curriculum or assignment or course or class into component parts and makes those parts visible. You know, we want people to know to know what public history is all about when they get done. Well, how do we know that a student is a good public history major unless we deconstruct what's going on? All right, another reason why we do it is, do assessment is, of course, to satisfy the demand for accountability by external agencies. And it used to be our external accrediting bodies were the only things we were worried about, but right now the big external agency that we're worried about is called the federal government. And there is a great push, and there's many, many people that believe that the federal government is going to take over higher education. And I say that with shock and dismay, but there are a lot of people who believe we're moving into federal standards. So that's why what we're doing is so important. The regional accrediting bodies need evidence from us to convince the federal government that we are adding value to our students' lives through this college experience. So, and that's basically what that says. So the federal government isn't saying you have to do X, Y, Z, give us a plan. The regional accrediting bodies are saying this, and the regional accrediting bodies are saying that in order to protect us from federal oversight. And tomorrow's a big summit on education, higher ed, at the White House, so we'll see what interesting things come out of that. It will probably be scary. All right, so another reason why the feds have been sort of intrusive in what's going on is because employers, businesses are telling their legislators that students are graduating without skill in certain areas. And if you look at these areas on the left, many of those areas are our gen ed, our core curriculum areas. All right. While applying knowledge skills to real world settings isn't one of our core competencies, it's certainly a student learning outcome in most programs. Locate, organize, evaluate info, promote, that's our information literacy. Innovation, creativity. Do we have a core?
Creative thinking.
Creative thinking, okay. All right, so we address that in the core. The teamwork, collaboration, maybe not, but we do have an intercultural core competency. So teamwork, collaboration in diverse group settings would connect with that. And then, of course, ability to connect persistent actions to ethical decisions. So we are addressing every single one of these key learning outcomes in our gen ed curriculum. Here you go.
Yes, why is it always the diversity becomes a subset rather than the way? Because the critical thinking cannot be emerged without the diverse element as a way of life.
Right.
You know? So I'm always surprised to say it's like a category, a subcategory. Okay, by the way, we have to expose these students to this or that. But then we cannot really generate the critical thinking.
Right.
We are, how do I say, we're doing emotions.
Right.
Critical thinking without,
Right.
you know.
This proper context.
Exactly.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about context. And the other thing that, and maybe we'll move here someday, we're not ready for that right now, but many programs, especially the health programs, they have to connect our core to their program outcomes. So we don't know exactly how we're going to talk about that piece. I mean, history, for example, has critical thinking as one of their program outcomes. So it's also a core learning outcome. So those two skills cross each other. I mean, the program and the core cross each other in this one program. But how are we going to address how our majors also address core? We're looking at core very discreetly, critical thinking. But in the end, our senior, how do we say the senior really got a holistic grounding in all of our core courses? We don't have that piece yet.
Right.
You follow me?
Is this the way that the program builds on the core competencies? So you learn these things in the core, and ideally those are supposed to be freshman and sophomore courses in those people's minds, although they're not necessarily that clear.
Like ethics.
Or, I think music majors majors take a lot of their core in the junior and senior year, right, and different things like that. But ideally, in the freshman and sophomore year, they have their gen ed requirements.
Right.
And then the programs build on that. And the question is how do those things build off of the core?
Right.
Which is a little bit not how we do it here to begin with in some ways, but that's what they're looking for. Is that coming?
No, I'm saying that's a model that some schools use, and they don't say you have to use that model.
Right.
But in reality, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. I mean, how do we at the end, because we're measuring these competencies at freshman and sophomore level, but did they get that whole experience at the end? So it's not something that we're going to be, and they're not going to cite us for that or anything, but it's just a different approach. I think it's a good approach, but for us it was just a little overwhelming at first.
Yeah, because given the core courses, it's supposed to expose the students to not only basic skills in critical thinking, but also some elements of liberal education, right? Which is supposed to broaden their thinking if you want to go to the upper levels. But I guess in terms of the history of a shift of including those diverse elements into our curriculum, it didn't really quite work out in the last decade because, for example, I use Asian cultures. It's all filled with seniors who have to fill the requirements to graduate. But when in fact these courses should be taken by freshmen or sophomores to say, oh, this is where I'm arguing with that it's something to be completed, but not organically there.
Right.
To really understand what university is as a critical source of critical thinking.
Right.
And so how do we integrate that? Can we use the J terms to make those students, sort of catch up?
Yeah.
So that they're not taking these courses at the senior just before.
Well, and I think that this is assessment. Allows these questions to emerge, and I think the essence of assessments is dialogue. So if we dialogue about this, what changes do we make because of it? So maybe your long-term goal will be is to have that as a better, cleaner, more articulated part of our intercultural awareness or something. All right, and hello, gentlemen. So again, another reason why we need to be attentive to this is because of what the business world, what the professional world expects of our students. And they want all of these skills that we are trying to measure in our core. So everything we're doing is in response to pressure from the feds right now. And the feds are responding to their business leaders. So getting back to what we're talking about is the defining of learning outcomes. I think we can everyone has a clear idea about what this is and what we, sort of an axiom on our assumption we all have to always remember that we are operating under is that we're all concerned with what's going on with the learner, all right, not the teacher. We're worried about what is happening with the learner. And how we construct an outcome will allow us to figure that out. So outcomes are related to learning. They should be capable of being assessed. And so I've talked to a lot of people about what type of language to use, and people have all shifted their language. A lot of people have put students should be able to. You don't even have to put able to. You can just say demonstrate, apply, articulate, argue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So something, whatever you're going to measure in terms of the student learning, has to be measurable. And you can measure effective changes, and it's a little difficult to do it in a objective way or by pencil and paper sometimes, but we can, we have two different ways of measuring outcomes, and we all know this, direct and indirect. So I'm going to get to that in just a second. remember this too. This is another area where we need some work. Not all outcomes are confined to learning in college. So I am managing the academic program piece. Diane Jones is managing the core piece. Jerry Tobin is managing the co-curricular piece. So what does, taking the leadership program from student life, how does that inform the college experience? That's another area where we have segregated ourselves, and we should integrate more. We should be talking to the people about, the first time they did the leadership program several years ago when a former Mercy Kemp was here, they did this whole program, and then I read about it. I said, well, why didn't you talk to us? We have a graduate program in leadership, and you didn't talk to us? And so, we need to start integrating co-curricular and curricular. But again, that is a future goal. We can't do everything in the first year, but I think as we all become immersed in this, people will say, this doesn't make sense. A big problem I've always had is the internships. So in health fields, in education, you all are in charge of these people's internships, whatever their clinicals. In many majors here at the college, students do internships, but there's no interaction with the faculty member. You may get a report from Kyle Faust. So it's always been a problem for me. I think, how do we learn about what our major should be doing if we don't have a deeper connection there? So this is also what assessment wants us to move in that direction. So people, all of us would say, even if our children went here, all of us wanted our children to live on this campus because we knew this other part of growing up was as important, and so do the accrediting bodies. So they are going to measure all of that. So we have to have service learning measured. Our career services have to be measured. Every single entity in the school has to be measured. But we should be talking to each other a little more than we are right now. Because that's what happens in life. It's just not this math problem you got away with. It was the math and how you use that budgeting when you were on the student government that's going to help you get a job. So we should be aware of all of that as we are building our programs. So what's new? We already measured student learning, and what we got in trouble for last time when they came was we didn't have enough evidence for them. And we didn't have evidence that we were going to do something with the results. All right, so we have to collect the information, share it with our colleagues, and then use the outcomes to improve learning. You guys have done this all the time. Everybody does this. Faculty does it. Faculty do this at the end of the year. You talk about students, you talk about what worked, what didn't work. Now we're just making, it's not us, it's the whole United States. We have to now give evidence about what's going on. So we have to inform others. And so that's what we're doing. So when we develop outcomes, there's a hierarchy of thought you should use to approach the development of them. Of course, the bottom level is it's all about you want the student to be successful, and that's a very broad. You want the student to be able to leave Mercyhurst saying that this big term value added, that this college added value to your life, both cognitively, socially, ethically, morally, spiritually, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is based on what our notion of student success is. And that notion can differ among majors. For physicians assistants, it's going to be different than for teachers and for guys in Intel, people in business. This notion of student success is all different. But you have to have that conversation. What does a successful major in our area look like? So it's very broad. And then you, actually, I said this all wrong. You should start from the top and work down. So you should start with, what is our institutional mission? That mission has to be seen in every single one of our programs. And you have a program mission. Everyone was required to submit a program mission that reflects our institutional mission. All right? The program mission is where you say, what is the graduate of our program going to look like? After you figure out that, you have to go down to the course level. So what are the outcomes at the program level that we need to have our students address? How can we make sure that they can go out into the workforce? I know the Intel people use a document published by, who was it published by, that showed the top skills for Intel majors. Not Intel majors, Intel analysts.
Mm-hmm.
What are the skills needed? So they use...
OD9.
What?
OD9, Office of Director of National Intelligence.
Okay, ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, publishes a
Skill sets, right.
Skill set.
Right.
And
No,
so all of their outcomes derive from that. Amy and all the people in interior design have what their accrediting body says their accreditor. You all have what's necessary. Mary Elizabeth has what's necessary. Raj has what his accrediting body is saying is necessary. So all these program outcomes are pretty much out there, easy to find. American Psychological Association publishes what they think all psych graduates should have. So those program outcomes should be the foundation for how you develop your own program outcomes. And I think that's exactly what has happened. We haven't seen many issues with program outcomes that are pretty good. When we get down to the course level outcomes, what should the course level outcomes do in relation to the program level outcomes?
So,
Go ahead, Steve.
well, to support that, right? I mean,
Support that, right?
Yeah.
So people always say, well, can I have 10 course outcomes in this course? I said, absolutely. So if you're doing if it's a research class, and they have to produce a research proposal at the end, your course level outcomes are apply APA correctly, craft compelling argument with X10 number of resources, blah, 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 blah. Those are going to be very discrete, but they have to support at least one of your program learning outcomes. So everything has to align. I talk about this alignment over and over and over. Everything has to align. Everything has to fit together. I think, and then in the end, so the goal is, so you can start at the bottom or start at the top, the goal is to have a student succeed and have the value added of a 4-year degree when they walk out of commercial university. So there's no question about how these connect, right? No. And a lot of you guys don't even have any options about how they connect. Those options are there, and you must, Mary Elizabeth has to follow what the state says about our education major. She has, and so they have hundreds, zillion of values and outcomes, and then they have to group them together under a set of, I don't know how many you all have in the end, 5 or 6 or 8, yeah. And best practices is now saying fewer outcomes, the better. So what are our primary, Diane Jones talks about this a lot. I think it's important for our majors too. What are our primary outcomes for our majors? Not discrete things, not like having the ability to read, operate GIS or read, output from the GIS. It's the analysis piece. Raj's skills are very high level, but in all business programs. But underneath, the finance major has to demonstrate these skills in different ways than this other major has to demonstrate. Yeah.
So if you're talking about some kind of fundamental invisible operative that the university students will embody, so that operative, whether it's an intelligent analyst or if you were social worker, or psychologist or physicist, really at some universal level we are operating from that
Yes.
base, right?
Yes.
I want to use the word like Dharma, for example. It's really we are operating from that Dharma level.
Okay.
That way you universally understand what this is, ethically, spiritually, and so that you're not, you study physics, but you know what the limit of nuclear, experimentation is within, right?
Right, but when you operationalize these outcomes in a program, it is a result of what our professional body is telling us, the profession tells us we need to know, what the literature tells us we need to know, and there's very few majors. I don't know if there's any majors that don't have any type of body that is above them. It may not be an accrediting body, but some kind of resource that tells you what the best practices are in that area. So the big problem is, so why are we talking about this? Because we used to we didn't publicize where program outcomes were. I asked all my graduate students last year, did you know what they expected of you in your major? All of them said no. No. I said, why not? And they go, well, I don't know. We just had to take these courses, and then we just assumed that the faculty knew what they were doing, which the faculty did know what they were doing, but now the public is saying, you have to show us what these outcomes are, and you have to show the students. They want to know what is expected of them. And so next year, beware, or be aware, every major in this college has to publish their student learning outcomes in our catalog. Has to be posted on our website. Every student learning outcome here's a sheet of paper for every program. Okay, we're going to put together a template, some language that says you should have your program mission, well, your department mission. The mission shouldn't change if you have different concentrations or different majors. You have your department mission, and then everyone has to publish in the catalog their program outcomes. You guys are going to have to get another book for you all.
You're publishing 185 mandated outcomes.
Yeah, no, we're going to do the ones that you guys are grouping. Hopefully you're going to group under. That's the accrediting body. That's the accrediting body outcome. Right. Yeah. So, but we have our, I didn't touch Cassie about that. Yeah, we can't do 185 of them, so nothing good. But, so everybody gets that, right? So that's not going to, it shouldn't make any more work. But as we sort of dive into this more deeply, people are starting to ask really good questions, and we need to recognize what's going on cognitively, emotionally with our students. At what level is the student in your class, and are you expecting too rigorous of an outcome from this student? It's like in a course like ethics. I mean, what's our goal in that course? That people understand that morals and ethics shape our decision-making process? I mean, what is our goal? You have to always think in terms of students. Like for the physician's assistant, you guys are having people who have degrees, often master's degrees already, and they're coming in, so your level of expectation is going to be different because you have adult students. What we expect of a little teeny freshman who's really straight out of high school, cognitively they haven't developed at the level we have. So we need to pay attention to what we're asking our students to do. So like at the end, if you look at that, we want in the beginning you're going to gain experience and confidence. How do you do that? You gain experience and confidence through learning the foundational bits of knowledge, right? And then then in turn, external control, your mother said you had to do this too. Now I have to do this on my own because my mom's not there telling me to get up. Although, of course, we know mothers do college students and tell them to get up. And I never did that. Accompanied, so I mean, all of these, I mean, sort of stuff that Keiko's addressing. You know, we move to self-centeredness to sensitivity, from simplicity to complexity, from dependence to independence, from impulsivity to self-control, and like in ethics, from instinctual to principled action. Are we cognizant of where our students are in their development, their cognitive development? So just something that we haven't talked about, but we should talk about, or not we, but your faculty colleagues, you should talk about that. Is this too high? Is my evaluate and analyze, is that at too high of a level for this student right now in this course? Another thing, and these are conversations I'm sure you have with each other, but are we paying attention to this when we develop our outcomes? When students come to your class, and I know all of you feel this, you think, what is this person doing in my class? You know, they have no price, like especially in applied field art or something. They've never drawn anything. They can't, you know, how do I address a student that has no prior knowledge? How do I even assess that? And I haven't seen in any plans that people give pre-tests and post-tests. But are the pre-tests foundational where you assess knowledge levels so that you think, okay, maybe my outcomes still work, but the way the outcome, the resource, the assessment maybe has to change because they're at such a different level. I can't expect them to be at this level at the end of the course. So I think after you go through a year and you talk to your colleagues, and some people who collected data in the fall term, they're already at this stage saying, what did you think? And quite easily people are saying, we need to do this. And sometimes, you know, this is going to be our action plan, we're going to change. But sometimes people don't know what our action plan is because they think nobody knew anything. Do we need another whole course? You know, do we need another course between college writing and literature? How many times this conversation? It's an eternal conversation. How many writing classes does a student need? So we have to pay attention to what is their prior knowledge. And then and maybe I'm getting confused with where I was a couple years ago. How do we develop competence in certain areas? Are we having the conversation about who is going over foundational skills? Do we assume that Sarah goes over all the foundational skills in biology before these students move to molecular or genetic? Or do we all assume that? Or do we know that? Have we had a conversation about that? I mean, I think that is missing in curriculums. People assume that other faculty are doing things. Assessment forces that conversation because you have the syllabi. Everyone has syllabi that they compare. You have outcomes, so your outcomes are on the syllabus. So, I'm expecting, you know, who's doing what. This is a very important. You want to make sure your graduates have using a wonderful education term, scaffolding, you know, have the courses been scaffolded properly so that as they move through, and you know how we are here, that class was full, so we're just going to put them in this class instead, you know, and sometimes that's a kiss of death to a student because they didn't have the prereq, or even if it's not a prereq, they didn't have this foundational knowledge. So this is a conversation that should occur after as we develop outcomes, as we change outcomes, as we look at our data. And then this metacognitive approach, you know, a very broad base. Do our students know how to think about the discipline? Do they know how they know? Can they look at this from a very high level? If they don't know something, do they know where to go get it? In a discipline, not a research skill, but how do they know they can get to this piece? Do they know what they know? That's sort of what metacognition is. And how do they know? And how do we measure if they know what they know? So these are very important questions to ask at the end of the year when you look at your data to see if you need to change your outcomes, if you need to change your plan, you know. So ask yourself these things. All these things about student development, how the mind works, all of them are important. And all of us know this stuff because most of us have children or work with students, so we know how they developed. But I think sometimes we just miss this conversation. We don't talk to each other about it, you know? All right. So is there a difference between objectives and outcomes? If there is a difference, do we care? Raj does not care.
I mean, you know, we all have an objective, but objectives themselves are difficult to measure, and that's why we have outcomes.
Right.
The outcomes would support the objective.
Okay, exactly. So an objective is sort of something simple that you want to. A lot of people use the word goals or something. The outcome has the action piece attached to it. All right, many of us with this new plan have developed what I would consider more objectives rather than outcomes, but we are moving in the outcome realm. So we're okay. I mean, you can look I'm sure you guys have Googled other maps and you look at it and they still use the word understand in it and you go, really? How do you measure that?
Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate, etc. So we talked about, how do you get to an objective from your program and then to your course. So the end piece of this is the most important. You want to design a course in a logical and scaffolded sequence of learning activities, which, and how many times have you gotten up and said, I know I do this with research, teaching research. I said, this isn't it doesn't lend itself to a linear format. I said, you have to know all of this stuff, but you discover that they don't know most of the stuff. And so somebody this past semester said to me, like the 12th class, you should have said that first. And I went, for you, that worked, because you would have understood that. But for the rest of the people, they wouldn't have understood it. So the scaffolding is really important. And this is stuff it's all part of who we are as faculty. Everybody does this regularly. I think that after your course, you say, was this in the right order? Don't you always go back and say, oh God, I need to do this one first, and second, this is a better example, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So here's the distinction with the outcome. It describes the behaviors a student will be able to perform at the conclusion of a unit of instruction, such as a class, a program, and the conditions and criteria which determine the acceptable level of performance. So I'm going to go through those. But we, in the plan, most people submitted really what I would call objectives. They were all measurable, but they didn't list what the performance was going to be. But we did list it in this, the assessment measure. We would say this is the objective, or we called it outcome, and then here's the performance measure. So let me give you some example. It's sort of like what Keiko was saying, it's all about context. So when you're talking about writing, and many of us have effective oral and written communication skills as part of our program objectives, program outcomes, all right? So how we're going to evaluate the student work and all of that is part of the outcome, what measure you're going to do. So you need to operationalize it. We all like that word in research. Again, is the context or condition under which the student will be expected to apply the knowledge, skills, or values apparent? And are the primary traits which we use in assessing student performance described? All right, let me give you some examples so this all makes sense. All right, here's an objective. Write a well-organized and reasoned response paper. In your particular class, in the course you're teaching a literature class, that you're writing this in response to available, that all made sense. But now, as we start to improve, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying, you guys all go back and change your outcomes right now to this measurable time. This will happen over the course of, working through your plan. They'll change. So instead we say, here's the context. How are you going to do this? Given an in-class writing task based on an assigned reading, very clear to the students. Demonstrate appropriate and competent writing. All right, so that's the objective. Well, how do we do this? We do it by articulating what they call traits. So we want you to demonstrate appropriate and competent writing which states a thesis, supports assertion, maintains unity of thought and purpose, is organized, blah, 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 blah. Where would you find those traits right now? Where do we find those right now? In a rubric. That's exactly right. So assessment people are just saying, our accrediting bodies are just saying, tell the students what you expect of them and how you expect to get it. So our plans have been, what we've required from everyone is, tell us what the outcome is, which a lot of times is objective, and tell us how you're going to get there, and then give us the rubric. This is just taking all of that, those three categories that we have used, and putting them into one, because you're putting the student learning outcome into a more detailed and robust form. So again, it's a future goal. Does this make sense? Yeah.
I have a question. I mean, this is so good, but are we assuming that the student arrive here with a bodily knowledge of some operative of the world, because they've been immersed in reading and AP courses and all that. And I find even the students who claim that they have AP courses in high school, in fact they are worse than who come with of the world, and because they have absorbed all these sensory data.
Right.
So when you say metaphor, so they understand the operative of how the ants, work, right?
Right.
But the AP student, I'm just saying, they know ants as A-N-T-S, or they understand ants is a collective, community of insects, blah, 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 but they don't understand how they operate.
Yeah.
So how do you
So this is, that's why you have to figure out what their prior knowledge is. What, before you start working, and this, I think as we move through assessment, at the end of the year, I think that's a conversation that you have to have with your colleagues. Okay, so these people did not have the prior knowledge. So do you then, what's your action? How are you going to change that? We definitely can't require another portion of the core. So what do you say? You say everybody who gets a score of 70 or below on this pretest that shows that they don't have any conceptual knowledge, they need to read some primer. They need to be presented with a glossary of terms. They need to, because they're already operating at a deficit. So this is all about assessment. So it's all about the learner. Where is the learner when he comes to you? And a lot of times we make these false assumptions. Yeah, because there's rate inflation, because there's bad schools, and
some of that becomes apparent when you don't achieve your learning outcomes. Okay, because
Right.
if you expect them to perform at a certain level,
right.
and many of your students don't, then you go back and try to find out, which is the whole purpose of assessment, find out why they're not achieving that. Is it
Yeah.
because I'm not teaching it, or is it because they come ill prepared? And then you may have to come up with some kind of strategy.
Right. And that's when this is all, I mean, my students I had far too many students at the graduate level who couldn't get the grade necessary. So what and it's all because they can't write. So what I'm going to give, visual writing assignments, I'm going to have some intensive workshops on the weekend. I'm going to address it that way and then evaluate it again, see if it works, because they came deficient to me already.
Or they've been taught in a certain way, which
Right.
really goes against this.
Well, and that's the mental model. They have a mental framework that it's very hard to adjust,
Yes.
especially old people like me. It's very hard for me to adjust my framework because that's how I've always done it. Right. Sarah?
One thing that, and I'm sure this is in other areas too, I think some departments or some majors kind of blend themselves nicely to this kind of stuff, and some majors not. I don't want to say that majors are harder to assess.
Yeah.
But so a struggle that we found when we initially started doing our plan, we had 12 learning outcomes, and that was a lot. But they were much more specific.
Right.
And that's kind of what we put together, and we said, because you have cell and molecular biology, and you have evolution, and you have ecology, and there are so many different levels, and we do need our students to have a understanding of content, in addition to the skills that we want them to have. And so when we narrowed those down into 8 learning outcomes, now they are more objectives. And so I guess what we're struggling with is how, and I think those objectives are going to be really difficult to assess. And how are we going to develop these outcomes so that we can get some useful data from them, but also encompass our entire major, I guess.
Yeah, and the higher ed is moving in a direction where, I mean, if you know anything about the Lumina Foundation and all the work they've done with their degree qualification profile, that's what Europe uses now. It's the Bologna Accord, and so people in Europe, if you studied in Florence, you can go to Berlin, Germany, then all the content is the same because of these outcomes. So what society is saying is that all of these outcomes should be applied in real world assignments. And so I think this will, when you say they're tricky to do, I mean, you guys have to have some type of research in the sciences. I would think you have to, prepare a hypothesis and then experiment and whatever. So I think that this is going to force us to say, how can we make sure that all of these things are really, the student is proficient? And this is also why this capstone, or whatever culminating assignment is in your class, like the business, what do you call it in your
Strategy course.
business strategy course, and Intel has some strategy
Strategic
course.
intelligence.
Yeah, strategic. So everybody, this is when that becomes so very critical. And Diane just attended a conference last week, and and what I'm reading is the culminating assignment should tell you as much about the program, or more, should tell you the most about your program. So these other outcomes that we're measuring, I mean, don't tie yourself in knots about, I'm going to, it doesn't have, you can have this course and can be an exam, but in the end, everything has to scaffold to this culminating assignment, and we should be able to see all of these skills. That's where the conversation needs to occur in your program. What else did you learn? Diane learned some good things in this thing. I don't want to put words in her mouth. No. Tell us some of we're just basically talking about stuff that most people know already. Put you on the spot.
Okay.
All right. You want to take a minute?
Tell us about the bars
We can get into a little bit. Yeah, well, the biggest thing was definitely the capstone course as a way to get both summative and formative information and the ways in which that you can do that. And not not really as much emphasis on how many students went to grad school and what the job placement was. That's not what they're talking about, the capstone experience.
Right.
It's really that thing that you have your students do that you say is they couldn't do that if they weren't successful in your program.
Right.
And this is sort of that perfect step between transitioning between university student and what's next for you. So that thing should either help them toward grad school or their career if that's what they're doing, but be sort of that you can't get to one without the other. It should be that important to their experience.
Yeah, and Middle States wants us to see summative assessments. They want us to see. They want to see. They want us to show them what our students are doing. And so you have the praxis exam, and you all have exams and clinicals, and we don't have but your seniors in English have a thesis, right? Or a senior English project. So everyone needs something, and we need to be attentive to that, and we need to report on that, because that is also, they don't want us getting caught in the weeds, stuck in the weeds. They want us saying that this course contributes this to this major goal down the road. This course is where they learn APA, and the person is crazy about making sure they have APA, so that when they do their thesis, there's no problem. Everyone knows APA. So how, and Diane's been talking about this in the core over and over. When still some people are still given maps that are so detailed, and what is the primary outcome for each course? What is the primary outcome of all your program goals? That's the one you concentrate on that course. That's the one you report on. You don't have to report on all facets. Report on that one. That's what they want to see. They don't want us to hang ourselves in the work. They want us to report on things like in your public health courses. I mean, there's obviously tons and tons of different skills and objectives they have to have, but each course really has one that is the most important. And that's what each course should have one, or maybe it's two. But a lot of times others can be subsumed underneath that one. So more is not better. And that's what we continue to hear, because I think the regional credit bodies are just hearing from colleges saying, you guys are killing us. So they're saying more is not better. Just make sure that they have these skills.
And to echo that, just on a real practical level, when you're looking at your program maps and your plans, the grid that you fill out, like which course has which of the outcomes, start with a goal of 1 per row and 1 per column. If you have every row and every column filled, you are just killing yourself with assessment. 1 row and 1 column gets an X in each row and 1 X in each column. Of course, there's a couple that you're going to have 2 on, and that's okay. But remember, you're only assessing the overarching most important thing in each course and not every single thing that course does, because it would be impossible to do everything that course does. We all know that. I mean, it's
Right.
just,
You also are under this incorrect notion that you have to have an introduce, develop, and mastery for each, and you do not. I said that a million times, but look at you have with all this stuff. And yeah, and clinical, although again, the health, they're a whole different animal. They have to have. Yeah. Sports med. I mean, and you were different too, actually. Yeah, because of your. No, you have to do that because of your accredited body, because it's state. Yeah.
But anybody who has like a career that like you pretty much assume that you have to go to grad school to master it, you're not going to have mastering on your thing, or else why would they go to grad school? So it's okay if you don't have a master if you're in a field that like it's impossible to master it as an undergrad. That's totally okay.
Yeah. You shouldn't have, in our OL program, the mastery is on the thesis. The mastery's on the thesis. Because the other ones are introduced or they're developed or whatever, like the theories of leadership and leadership theory, they're introduced and maybe developed, but they're not mastered then. You don't master until you finish the program. Or here's another example where we have sort of an original objective, understand and apply scientific method. So now if we want to do it using traits and context, given a hypothesis. I probably should say and. Given an hypothesis. Is that right? No, it's not hard. It's a hard H, so it's okay? Okay, all right. Design an experiment. All right, so what do you do? Design an experiment and interpret data according to the scientific method in order to evaluate the hypothesis. Most people had their student learning outcomes would be just like that objective set, okay? A real learning outcomes is going to include, again, these characteristics or traits of how you're going to do it, which are also the aspects that you would see on a rubric, okay? Because in order to do this successfully, we're going to make sure that you approach the scientific method in an appropriate way, you formulate questions, you design things. All of that would be part of a rubric, all right? All right, I think we can do this. Now, another sort of area that we haven't talked about much this past year is how then do you measure what is acceptable in your program? What guidelines, what's the context for your program review? So if you have standards, that would be something like, that's something in your class. I teach PE and I want everybody to complete 1 mile, have to be able to run 1 mile. It doesn't matter how well she does it, doesn't matter how well he does it, it's against a standard. You have to complete it and you would have to have a standard in 20 minutes, okay? That's a standard. So either you meet the standard or you don't meet the standard, all right? Other programs, we benchmark. You use benchmarks. Your goal or your program, maybe one of your program goals is to produce the best nurses, the best physician's assistants in Northwest Pennsylvania. You want to produce the best physician's assistants in Northwest Pennsylvania. So how do you benchmark? You have to look at other schools and what their scores are and say, all right, the average score was what is the bottom score you can get on a test in order to meet the standard. Do you have to take a culminating exam?
The board exam.
Yeah, the board exam. What's the?
It's like in the 76.
Oh, 76. So you think we're going to rock So you're going to say our students will score, 90%. Of course, I would never do that.
Yeah.
But so how do you measure? Like Intel, you guys can't measure against anything. There's no benchmarks for you all to measure. You just have to set standards. But some programs do. Like if you have a certain exam on the American Chemical Society exam, if you have a standard exam for the business school, those are benchmarks, scores that you can try to use as guidelines for your evaluation. And then we have courses where an extracurricular, co-curricular, where we just want to see the student grow, gain an ability to discern right from wrong, from moral judgments from immoral. Those are a little tricky, but you want to think about that when you decide how you're going to set a standard. And Megan talks about this when she talks about her pre and post tests and so on. Most of us use standards that we set forth. So OL, my standard was everyone, or 80% needed to get an 83% or higher on this research proposal. Where did I get 83 from? It is the lowest level B in our program. So graduate students need to get A's or B's. That's where I got it. Made sense. We all faculty got together. We all decided that's a good standard. So the standards have to be, you can't have moving targets. You can't say, oh, holy, we're at 76 and we said 77. We're going to change that standard. That's what's happening in America. We can't do that. Okay? We have to have our standard and then you stick to your standard and then you have an action plan if the standard didn't work. And why they're sort of looking at this value-added approach to assessment now is because historically we have measured and legitimized higher ed based on who are your faculty, how many credit hours do you have, how many majors do you have, how many departments do you have. It was all infrastructure stuff. It was administrative stuff. And the more stuff, the better you were, obviously. So that's been sort of a historical, how we have legitimized higher ed. Well, the public's saying, we don't buy that anymore. That just because you have these world-class faculty, because the other side of having world-class faculty is A, maybe they never teach. B, all they do is research. C, they never touch students. There's all kinds of people say this doesn't really tell us what's going on. And so now we're having this. Again, value added. What value does a college degree give to your student? We have to demonstrate that. And so there's all kinds of different frameworks for assessment, but this Aston model is very well known. Alexander Aston's a big researcher in higher ed and does a lot of retention. Inputs are our students. What do we say about our students? How do our students come to us? Well, Harvard does better because their students come to them looking a little different than our students do. So input has a great deal to do with what goes on in your organization. And when you don't understand that, and if there's a disconnect, that is harmful to maybe your productivity in the classroom. If you assume that our students are somebody they are not, it's a bad scene for you and it's a bad scene for us. It's a bad scene for the student.
Well, that's a comment. You were talking earlier about setting benchmarks. And what I've always said to people is if you set a benchmark that's reasonably low, like 70% of our students will achieve 80% of all the outcomes, and if your results come in better than that, then you can raise that.
Yeah.
But if you set it at 100%, how do you show continuous improvement? And one of our departments did that. They said 100%. Of course they didn't meet that goal.
No, yeah.
So I tell people set it around 65, 70%, and you can show improvement every year if you want to, couple percent. And the states will be happy because you're using the information to improve your outcome achievement.
Right. So, of course, again, accreditors look at, well, they don't look at it. We need to look at the input. We are the environment. Okay, what environment are we providing to these students so that if they are deficient, they will still succeed? And then the public accountability piece is a discussion of our outcomes. One of the big emerging issues that is in front of us right now is transparency. And we have been opaque, right? We must be transparent. We have to come up with, what is our formula here? What are we going to require programs to post externally? I said that all of our outcomes have to be posted externally on the www site, but not our where the standards met or not. So we need to have this very serious conversation about what do we post, because you know what publics have to post? Everything. Publics have to post everything. Public universities, state funded. We have some wiggle room, some flexibility, but still we have to be proud of what we're doing, and so we have to make sure that we publish what is in our best interest, but is honest. So this is a conversation that needs to happen now that we have this new software. We have levels of approval and stuff, and what are we going to publish? And it's a tricky question. We're used to not telling anybody anything, so it's not a good strategy.
Missy, our accrediting body requires we publish our pass rate for the last 5 years, constantly.
Okay, on a www site.
It
Yeah.
has to be visible and easily found. It can't be buried. So that's a standard that we have to.
And I went. Are the nursing programs like is education like that? Do they? Yeah. Do they require that we publish practice scores?
But if we're competing with a local state university, it would be in our best interest to be able to compare.
Yeah. Right.
I think you used to be able to look up praxis for any school. Average student practice score and the praxis score. I'm sorry, you used to be able to look that up.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a requirement that we have to share the findings.
Right.
What we don't know yet is what findings and how much.
Right.
So that will be at our discussion to agree.
So we have, obviously, in those days, the person coming tomorrow, so that may be a question we ask of him. What do they recommend? So then we also have direct and indirect measures. We've been primarily talking about direct measures, student work. Like Raj, IACBE expects an indirect and a direct measure. Do you all have indirect measures that you have to do?
Chemistry has for accreditation.
Okay. Yeah, I would think that you would too. So an indirect measure is a survey, is the NESI, is the SERP, is some type of alumni survey, anything like that. Those give student perspectives on what's going on. So, but you cannot, what we used to do, what most schools did, was they relied on these indirect measures. Oh, they're highly satisfied. Everyone's satisfied. Everybody bought that. But people aren't buying that anymore. So, yes.
One of the things about the indirect assessment there are my student who kind of met his crisis, meaning he was, using some traditional mode of going about his learning, and then that didn't work. So, he got a D on his midterm report. And so he came to my office and we discussed what that was. And then he took my direction that I gave earlier to his heart, and he really, worked on it. And then he came and said, "What is this I'm doing? Like this." And so I guess this is internally felt kind of, personal growth, which I call it perspectival shift. Because his perspective is shifted now that he knows that he can do this, and from the rest he just kind of naturally came, worked on his favor.
And again, Keiko, we could go back with your comment too. We assume people have this skill set. You assume that he had the ability to argue, persuasively argue, whatever. It was clear later that he did not. And so that's what assessment will tell us. And we go back then to, so what do we do for these people who are deficient coming in the door? Yeah.
Another popular indirect assessment measure is exit interviews. So if you do exit interviews with your students when they go out the door, that's a really popular indirect. As long as you record the data the right way. But that indirect measurement, usually it's done at exit interviews. If you think you can't get your faculty, just require a 20-minute meeting before the seniors walk out to graduation.
Right.
We have to do alumni. But alumni
Yeah.
have like 2 years and 5 years.
It's pretty standard.
Yeah. You have to do that too for us?
So we use it, they don't require that,
No.
but they want, because at the point of graduation, a student is not easily able to demonstrate all the skills.
Right.
So we want that person 3 to 5 years out to be able to state where all the things that he or she learned are they useful in the workplace.
Right, right. And that makes sense. All right, so these are just examples of indirect methods. And this is, I mean, I'm trying to talk about this book, and one whole chapter is just on tests and measurements, and I mean, it's, you need a math degree to understand that, some of it. And we don't need to do that. I mean, Diane's using a lot of tests that are, you know, reliable and cost-effective and efficient, and so obviously one outcome is not best. One measure is not best for all outcomes. And then there's some great examples here. Here's Bloom's taxonomy. It's Bloom's taxonomy. It's another picture of Bloom's taxonomy. This is my favorite one right here because it shows skills, but it also shows the inside is the skill, like right here, application. This quadrant right here are verbs that you could use to measure application. Here are examples of actual assignments, assessment measures. So they're just, it provides good food for thought and good, you know, discussion for your colleagues about, well, how are we going to do this? If we want to measure just knowledge level, how can we do this?
Missy, do you think we could have that one available in a more readable form? Because it seems like it's providing a lot of language.
I can send it to you. Yeah. Yeah. And here's another, I mean, this is a really detailed example. Here's some more examples. We don't have time to do this. Here's a bunch of good resources for you, the different references I use. But basically the modifying is all about after this, in June, when you get together with your faculty and talk about this, what are the changes that you're going to make? And you can do this. You can change, you can delete an outcome, you can make it more robust, you can modify it, you just report on it. And that's what they want us to do. Report on what's going on, especially if it's to improve, if the students didn't meet the standard. You want to show how you're going to improve. So, any additional questions? Thanks for your good attention and participation. That was appreciated. But again, it's a journey. It's all a journey. And any help that you all can provide us, I mean, we have, you know, people come out of the woodwork and sort of say, because you do? Come in, sit down. Let's talk to you. So there's a lot of people out here who know a lot about assessment. So I feel confident that we're moving in the right direction. I have, our goal is to get off warning when they come to visit us in September. We have to prepare a report this summer, and our goal is, and so that's why the pressure is on all of you all to gather data. But not a whole bunch, on one outcome, at least, one outcome.
Missy, when the person comes tomorrow from Middle States, is there a public outcome?
You know what, there is a meeting for, there is a time for deans and department chairs. Phil was supposed to reach out to people.
I think it's at the end of the day, and Phil did leave it open. So if there's anybody at that level who would like to sit down with him, it seems like it's going to be an informational session. So it seems like the gentleman who will be coming will be speaking to those people about what process are we in, what's happening now, why is he here today, what's going to happen next. So it'll be really informational about.
I can send you the agenda.
Yeah.
I would appreciate
Okay.
that.
I think it's at the end of the day. Isn't it like 3:30 or something? I don't know either. But,
Yeah.
but
It's
there
in the
is
afternoon, for sure.
There is a time